everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for 3 Centuries of the Portrait. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes as a couple more people join us. All right, perfect. It looks like we're all set. So thank you again. Thanks for joining us today for 3 Centuries of the Portrait. This is part 2 of a lecture series that we're doing here at the Timken. And so we're so excited to have you join us. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourself muted throughout the lecture. You are all muted right now, so that's totally okay. And save any questions that you may have at for the end. If you do have any questions though, and you want to place them in the chat, please feel free to do so. There should be a little chat button at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that section in order to drop your questions, and we'll be happy to address those at the end as well. If you're joining us over Facebook, you can do the same in the comment section of the Facebook stream. You can add a question there, and we'll be monitoring those as well so that we can answer any questions that you may have as well. Other than that, though, also, if you would like to access this tour afterwards, it'll also be up on our YouTube channel and on our social media channels as well. So that is something that you can do if you would like to go back and listen. Otherwise, though, again, we are so happy to have you joining us here today for 3 Centuries of the Portrait, presented by Elinor. We're so excited to have her here with us. And so I'll go ahead and turn that over to her today.
Good morning, everyone. As Samantha mentioned, my name is Elinor Merl, and I'm a docent with the Timken Museum, and I'm delighted to be with you today for the second in our 3-part lecture series on 3 Centuries of the Portrait. Today, I'll be talking about the 17th century painter, Anthony van Dyck, and his contribution to the genre of the portrait. Now, no painter has done more to define an era than Anthony van Dyck. He was a Flemish Baroque artist who became the leading portrait painter in England after success in the southern Netherlands and Italy. A sign of his success is that he's associated with 1,023 portraits, and he had a relatively short lifetime of 42 years, so that's quite impressive. Famous in his own lifetime, Van Dyck's work characterizes our image of the court of Charles I. Charles had become King of England, Scotland, and Ireland in 1625 on the death of his father, James I. Van Dyck's portraits of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria and the courtiers who surrounded them are images of regal majesty, gilded youth, and feminine beauty. They evoke an age of sumptuous costume and cultivated ease. All this color and languid elegance was shortly to be swept away in a bloody civil war, which would slaughter many of the men, widow the women, bring down the whole edifice of divine right monarchy, and culminate in the public execution of that same ruler whom Van Dyck had represented as a Christ-like figure, a loving father and husband, and the epitome of dignity and melancholy sensitivity. The majority of Van Dyck's subjects were aristocrats who, in their sumptuous garments and their dignified and often arrogant bearing, could only gain by the grace and refinement of Van Dyck's treatment. In the 17th century, demand for portraits was greater than for other types of work, and everyone wanted to be painted by Van Dyck. He was one of the first fashionable portrait painters, able to give an appearance of refined elegance for subjects who may have lacked those qualities. Van Dyck was born in 1599 in Antwerp to a wealthy silk merchant. He was a very talented, precocious painter who started his training at age 10 and became an independent artist when he was 16 years old. By 1618, he'd become a master in the Antwerp Guild of St. Luke. Within a few years, he was to be the chief assistant to the dominant master of Antwerp and the whole of Northern Europe, who of course was Peter Paul Rubens, who made much use of subcontracted artists as well as his own large workshop. His influence on the young artist was immense. Rubens referred to the 19-year-old Van Dyck as, and I quote, "the best of my pupils," end quote. Here we have a portrait of Rubens by Van Dyck, which was done in 1627. In 1620, Van Dyck visited London for a few months, long enough to paint a history picture, The Continents of Scipio, for the royal favorite George Villiers, Marquess of Buckingham. And we're going to talk more about George Villiers shortly. If the name sounds familiar, it's because he was Mary Villiers' father, whose portrait is in our collection. And again, we'll be getting there shortly. Interest in this story by Livy from Roman times was revived in the Renaissance, and the episode figured widely thereafter in both the literary and visual arts, as well as opera. This self-portrait was likely painted by Van Dyck while he was in London during his stay in the winter of 1620 to 21. He chose to render a depiction of himself as a country gentleman dressed in fine clothes. He likely acquired these clothes due to his father's being a wealthy clothier. After this London sojourn, Van Dyck spent most of the next 5 years in Italy, chiefly in Genoa, making imposing portraits of the wealthy aristocracy of that city in their somber palazzi. Here's a portrait from this period. The Genoese noble woman painted by Van Dyck reflects dress trends of the early 17th century, particularly in the region of Genoa, such as rich silks ornamented with metallic lace, starched ruffs, and the deep V-shaped bodice. Van Dyck's ability to translate the conversation between light and fabric is evident in this portrait. Every pleat, stitch, and gather seems to glisten. When compared to Van Dyck's other Genoese portraits, it contains very similar light, architecture, and level of formality, so much so that if we were to line up all his Genoese portraits next to one another, it would appear the families could very well be occupying the same room. It's this consistency that made him a highly sought-after portraitist of aristocratic Genoese families. Now notice that the background here is only suggested, not described. Van Dyck's hasty brushstrokes can easily be made out and is deliberately contrasted by the painter with the careful, even painstaking rendering of the figure of the Marquesa herself. Now, Charles I's reign was not without its drama. One of the issues of contention with the British public was his religious convictions. Queen Henrietta was Roman Catholic, which was a problem. But Charles's religious convictions were not the only thing to come under scrutiny. His relationship with George Villiers, who we mentioned earlier, the first Duke of Buckingham, also caused discontent among those who believed that his favorite had too much influence. George Villiers, first Duke of Buckingham, was an English courtier, statesman, and patron of the arts. He was a favorite and possibly also a lover of King James I of England. Buckingham remained at the height of royal favor for the first 3 years of the reign of Charles, James's son, until a disgruntled army officer assassinated him. In 1632, Van Dyck was invited to the court of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria. That same year, he was knighted by Charles I and made the principal court painter, the first time anyone had been made a court painter. And Charles commissioned numerous portraits from him, not only for members of their own family, but also for foreign friends and ambassadors. He was a tireless worker, painting almost exclusively portraits of the Caroline court, about 400 in total, including some 40 images of King Charles. Van Dyck received a quiet house of his own, along with a handsome pension of £200 annually. He died at age 42 and was buried in Old St. Paul's Cathedral, an indication of his standing at the time of his death, with the epitaph, and I quote, "Anthony van Dyck, who, while he lived, gave to many immortal life." He spent only 7.5 years of his short life in England. By this time, he was recognized as the leading court painter in Europe, with Velázquez at the court of Philip IV of Spain, his only rival. He also excelled as a superbly observant painter of children, and even more appealing to the English nobility, dogs. Van Dyck's ability to paint floating silks and elegant men and women is world-renowned. He'd now reached the zenith of fame and prosperity. The courtly and handsome figure of Charles I, as he exists today in our imaginations, owes a great deal to Van Dyck. When portrayed by other painters with more honesty and less skill, Charles becomes a very different and less appealing figure. So let's follow Van Dyck's journey with the English court. This work, Charles I and Queen Henrietta, with their 2 eldest children, Prince Charles and Princess Mary, was Van Dyck's first commission following his appointment as court painter to Charles in 1632. It shows Charles and his queen, Henrietta Maria of France, with their 2 eldest children, Prince Charles, later Charles I, standing before his father, and Princess Mary in her mother's arms. In the background, we glimpse a silhouetted view of Parliament House, Westminster Hall, and possibly the clock tower. The painting was known as the Great Piece at the time, and Charles hung it prominently in the palace at Whitehall. What sets the picture apart from other paintings of the period is the apparently effortless way in which Van Dyck seemed able to combine the formal demands of official state portraiture with the informalities of family domesticity. Its size, the acres of shimmering silk, and the grand classical column lend the image official gravity. Yet at the same time, the king and queen are seated. Charles has placed his crown on one side, and 2 tiny dogs play between the royal couple. The composition is, in essence, a royal conversation piece. The influences that are at work in such a painting reveal the true level of Van Dyck as an artist. Only Rubens and Velázquez treated royal sitters with such apparent nonchalance and insight, while the warm colors and dramatic sky bespeak a profound knowledge of Titian. On May 1st, 1625, Charles married by proxy Henrietta Maria of France, first meeting her in Canterbury the following month. The marriage proved successful for Charles, producing 5 surviving children. However, the match was not approved of by all, particularly those in Parliament who feared his wife's Roman Catholic background would cause religious problems closer to the home. They were to be proved right, as despite Charles's assurances to Parliament that religious restrictions on Catholics would not be altered, he had already made such a promise to the Catholic brother-in-law, Louis XIII of France. In February 1626, the following year, Charles's coronation took place at Westminster Abbey without his wife by his side, and made clear the disapproval of the Protestant ceremony. Now, Van Dyck was quite a flamboyant character, always wearing a sunflower because it was greatly admired by Charles I. And here's a very well-known self-portrait which nicely depicts the artist's personality. The self-portrait features the artist looking over his shoulder at the viewer. His gaze centers on the viewer as if calmly startled by the presence of an onlooker. His right hand is poised to touch the bottom petals of a yellow sunflower. His left index finger and thumb hold a gold chain that extends across his right shoulder and down his posterior side. This is a visual trick of calling attention to the chain and the message it portrays. The chain is understood to be a gift the artist received from Charles I, his patron. The gold chain holds a medal with the king's likeness on it, but is concealed by the artist's right arm sleeve. He's portrayed to be outdoors in nature, as seen by the clouds in the background. He's clothed in a richly dyed pink overcoat with a white shirt visible on his collar, shirt cuffs, and a slender slit on his back. Excuse me. The light source is radiating from the bottom left corner, illuminating the outer petals of the sunflower. This gives the visual effect of the sunflower shining on Anthony van Dyck's face in approval, a common interpretation of the sunflower. Since Van Dyck was well known for his many attempts at capturing his own likeness on canvas, viewers were exposed to his unique style through his artwork. Van Dyck was capable of influencing 17th century Englishmen into adopting his mannerisms and outward appearance. He was known for wearing his facial hair in a particular way and would later popularize the look by painting his various models with the same beard. The style, known as the Van Dyck beard, came to consist of a mustache and goatee with the hair on the cheeks completely shaven. The mustache could be curled at the tips and include or exclude a soul patch, that would be a chin beard, depending on personal preference. The look was thought to have regal and stately appearance, and King Charles I himself often liked to be depicted wearing the facial hair in his portraits. Because Charles I was seen so often sporting the Van Dyck beard, it also was referred to as the Charlie. The trend slowly died out before practically disappearing from fashion during the English Restoration under the rule of King Charles II. Early in 1635, Van Dyck had painted a group of the Queen's eldest children to be sent to her sister Christina, Duchess of Savoy, in exchange for portraits of the Duchess's children. However, it was reported that the king was angry with Van Dyck because his eldest son was shown still wearing skirts, as young boys did at this stage. But the king wanted the more grown-up and impressive breeches. It may partly have been to placate the king that Van Dyck completed this more adult group, presumably painted between November of 1635 and March of 1636. In the second design, Prince Charles is wearing breeches, and the children are accompanied by two King Charles spaniels. The backdrop is richly embroidered Italian velvet. The colors in the costumes are opulent, a deep gold contrasting with a rose pink and the very blue note in the whites. The dogs are painted with remarkable fluency, and a touching relationship is established between the two little boys. This triple portrait of Charles I was also done in 1635 to 1636, and it's also known as Charles I in three positions. The painting shows the king from three viewpoints. The colors of the costumes and pattern of the lace collars are different in each portrait, though the blue ribbon of the Order of the Garter is present in all three. The painting was sent to Rome in 1636 to be used as a reference work for the Italian sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini to create a marble bust of Charles I. Bernini famously acclaimed upon seeing the painter, I quote, "It was the portrait of a doomed man." Here we have Van Dyck's portrait of Queen Henrietta Maria from 1636. The pregnant Queen of England cradles her arms over her abdomen while standing next to a crown that advertises her rank. Queen Henrietta Maria commissioned the painting as a gift for Cardinal Francesco Barberini, who viewed the devout French-born queen as a critical collaborator in his dream of regaining England for the Catholic Church. Destined for a leading patron of the arts in Baroque Rome, Van Dyck's portrait was one of the many diplomatic gifts that spread the artist's fame and influence throughout Europe. Let's now move on to three equestrian portraits by Van Dyck of Charles I. Now, equestrian portraits are usually reserved for the military and political leaders, following a tradition whose origin lies in the iconography of such rulers as Alexander the Great and Marcus Aurelius. A horse is a pedestal upon which leaders can elevate themselves above the common people. But the equestrian format is also a metaphor for taming and training nature, an indication of the potential of the rider to guide the populace and subdue external enemies. Charles I was particularly in need of these kinds of symbolic associations, as he wasn't physically imposing. He was only 5 feet 4 inches tall, and he suffered from a speech impediment. Nor was his rule glorious. He was eventually beheaded after a long and costly civil war. Charles I, with Monsieur de Saint-Antoine from 1633, is the first of the three equestrian paintings Van Dyck did of Charles I. It depicts Charles accompanied by his riding master, Pierre Antoine Bourdon. Charles I is riding a white horse towards us through a triumphal arch. Van Dyck has used the architecture to provide compositional structure, splitting the scene into 3 vertical sections and positioning a key element in each. So we have a coat of arms, the king, and a figure dressed in red. Together, they create a roughly pyramidal form with the king's head at the apex. Now, the simplicity of layout has been animated with the addition of some billowing green drapery and the movement of the human and animal figures. Especially notice the foreshortened body of the horse as it steps forward, its front hoof touching the edge of the picture plane. Each of the ancillary elements of the painting contains additional information that contributes to the overall message of Charles's authority to rule. The royal coat of arms, for example, contains the insignia of England, that's 3 lions, Scotland, a lion rampant, and Ireland, a harp, to show the unification of the nations of the United Kingdom under the rule of Charles's father, James I. The figure dressed in red is Pierre-Antoine Bourdin, Seigneur de Saint-Antoine, an expert riding master who had been sent to Charles by the King of France as a diplomatic gift, along with 6 thoroughbred horses. Saint Antoine's reverential and subservient gaze further enhanced the king's mystique in our eyes, but perhaps also symbolizes England's longed-for preeminence over her European neighbor. Van Dyck's most significant message about Charles is his supremacy as a military leader. The presence of a triumphal arch, a structure built to celebrate and commemorate victories in ancient Rome, implies that this English king is the natural heir to the triumphant emperors of the classical past. Charles's highly polished armor and baton of command compound this message, as does the blue sash around his chest and medallion at his hip, which shows him to be a member of the Order of the Garter, the most prestigious knighthood in England. Thus, Van Dyck is appropriating the iconography of medieval knights errant, as well as classical rulers, in order to appeal to his audience's sense of history. Recall that Van Dyck studied with Peter Paul Rubens and noticed the similarity of Van Dyck's composition to that of Rubens' work on the right, called Equestrian Portrait of the Duke of Lerma from 1603. So you have the same positioning of, the horse and the rider. So very likely this was something that Van Dyck was quite aware of, this other painting by Rubens. This is the second equestrian portrait of Charles to be painted by Van Dyck, and Charles is depicted here wearing the same suit of armor, riding a heavily muscled dun horse with a peculiarly small head. To the right, a page proffers a helmet. Charles appears as a heroic philosopher king, contemplatively surveying his domain, carrying a baton of command with a long sword to his side, and wearing the medallion again of the Order of the Garter. His melancholy, distant expression was seen as a sign of wisdom. A tablet tied to a branch has the inscription, Charles I, King of England, and this was a political statement at the time, only 33 years after James had united the crowns of Scotland and England and proclaimed himself King of Great Britain, and nearly 70 years before the Acts of Union legally created the Kingdom of Great Britain. Charles I at the Hunt from 1635 is the third of the equestrian portraits of King Charles I. It depicts Charles in civilian clothing and standing next to a horse as if resting on a hunt, in a manner described by the Louvre as, and I quote, a subtle compromise between gentlemanly nonchalance and regal assurance. Charles is dismounted and stands as if surveying his domain and the seas beyond. His head is turned and his face pinched in a disdainful and somewhat bitter smile. The king was famously sensitive, as I mentioned, about his height, and the painting compensates by placing the viewer at a low angle point of view, looking up at the king. And that same Latin inscription that we saw on the second work is also included here about Charles, the King of Great Britain. Charles is dressed as an aristocratic gentleman in a wide-brimmed cavalier hat, teardrop earrings, shimmering silver doublet, red breeches, and turned-down leather boots, apparently resting during a day of hunting. His sword is attached with a girth, and one hand rests nonchalantly on a walking stick. The other hand rests on his hip, holding his gloves as a sign of his sovereignty and assurance. The painting also shows a young page and Charles's picture-buying agent and favorite courtier, Endymion Porter, who's holding the horse. The horse seemingly bows its head in submission to the king. Now, it was in the same period that these works were done that Van Dyck painted the work in the Timken collection, which we'll now take a look at. Here is Mary Villiers, Lady Herbert of Shirland from 1636. Mary Villiers was a favorite of King James I of England. And after her father's assassination, and remember, George Villiers was her father, and we mentioned that he was assassinated. He was assassinated when Mary Villiers was only 6, and she was then raised in the royal household where she enjoyed the status of princess. King James's son, Charles I, of course, arranged her marriage at age 12 to Charles Lord Herbert, who was then 15, the oldest son of Lord Pembroke, a man of considerable fortune and one of Van Dyck's earliest patrons. Lord Herbert and Lady Mary were married in 1635 in the Royal Chapel at Whitehall. The employment of the king's private chapel is a sufficient demonstration of the affection in which both were held by King Charles. Tragically, Lord Herbert died of smallpox just 2 years later in 1636, which is when this portrait was commissioned by Charles I, in whose collection it hung. And if you had occasion to look on the back of the work, Charles's initials are on the back. Though she was only 14 years old at the time, she emerges from the plain, dark background in dignified splendor, pointing to one of the black ribbons that suggests her recent widowhood. Heavy pearls gleam at her ears and neck, and she wears the latest fashion, a glowing, low-cut taffeta gown trimmed with silvery lace. Her calm, dispassionate gaze, like her pale skin, signify aristocratic refinement. Now, sadly, Lady Mary Villiers' string of losses didn't end with the death of her father and her first husband. 2 subsequent husbands predeceased her, as did both her children at age 10 and 18, most likely from tuberculosis. Now, if we take a look at the portrait I showed you earlier of Queen Henrietta Maria, which was done the same year, we see that both are wearing what appear to be the same pearls, and that the queen is also wearing the black ribbon of mourning. We don't know if Mary Villiers borrowed the pearls from the queen, but the same pearls, known as the Mancini pearls, still exist today. Next, we have a portrait Van Dyck painted the following year in 1637 of Mary Villiers on the occasion of her second marriage to the Duke of Lennox. This is Lady Mary Villiers as Saint Agnes. Lady Mary is depicted as Saint Agnes in a rocky cave, holding a palm branch in her left hand and resting her right hand on a lamb. Saint Agnes was the patroness of those about to be married, and as I mentioned, the portrait was probably painted on the eve of her second marriage. Our next portrait, a group portrait, was also done in 1637. And this is the 5 eldest children of Charles I. Now, just to give you a sense of the size of these works, this work, which was comparable to others that Van Dyck had done, is about 3 feet by 6 feet. So these were quite monumental works. And Van Dyck's masterful painting acknowledges both the youth and the status of its royal subjects, breaking with the earlier tradition of presenting royal children as miniature adults. The picture was commissioned by Charles I. The 5 children are shown left to right: Princess Mary, who was later Princess of Orange and mother of William III, James, Duke of York, after James I, Prince Charles, later Charles II, Princess Elizabeth, and in her sister's lap, Princess Anne. The future Charles II rests his hand on the head of an enormous mastiff. The mastiff had been a guard dog since Roman times and appears here as a protector for the royal children at a time of civil unrest. Nonetheless, the position of the young prince's hand suggests that he's capable of ruling this powerful beast and by implication, this country. And again, you notice how Van Dyck paints, the dogs, and he's quite masterful. Here's a study for the prior painting of the 2 youngest children of Charles I. Sadly, both died. Princess Elizabeth at age 15 and Princess Anne at age 3, also of tuberculosis. This was Van Dyck's last self-portrait, done 1940 to 41, and it was painted the year before his death in 1941. He looks over his right shoulder to catch your eye, breaking his focus on some task off canvas. The frame is thought to have been original to the work, possibly even designed by Van Dyck himself. You notice the sunflower at the top of the frame mirroring the sunflower from Van Dyck's earlier self-portrait. For the next 300 years, Van Dyck was the major influence on English portraiture. Nearly all the great 18th century portraitists, including Thomas Gainsborough and Joshua Reynolds, copied Van Dyck's costumes, poses, and compositions. Quite an influential artist whose works continue to enrich our lives. This brings us to the close of our tour. I hope I brought Van Dyck to life for you within the context of his time and place. Thank you for attending, and we invite you to join us next week on Tuesday, June 29th, for the final presentation in this series, John Singleton Copley's New York Portraits.
Thank you so much, Elinor. That was such a great presentation. Van Dyck's portraits are amazing. So thank you so much for that tour through his portraits of the family, of the royal family. Thank you so much. Yeah, so if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take those now and kind of run through those. I do see a comment from Sharon talking about how hands are probably very difficult to do, which is true. I mean, just speaking from my friends' experience who are fine arts students, hands are always the things they complain about. So, it's interesting to kind of look at these big, kind of portraits. And I would say that probably, the focus is on the face. So that might be part of why some of the hands don't look as fully formed. But I think, on the whole, the whole image is still quite striking. Let's see. Yeah, so if you do have any questions or comments, feel free to either unmute yourself at this point and feel free to ask, or you can drop them in the chat, as I mentioned earlier. Let's see. I think someone was trying to comment, but it cut them off, so I'll let them type a little bit. But while we're doing that, I love, I was going to say, I love the kind of progression of the equestrian portrait that you showed earlier. I think that one's super interesting. You kind of have this first one of him looking very regal, and then you kind of end up on that last one where he's off his horse and, he's kind of surveying his land. And so it's a really interesting, kind of progression through the equestrian portrait there, which, as you mentioned, is a huge tradition in many different forms. Let's see. Oh, so Claire is asking, was King Charles's execution after Van Dyck died?
Yeah, they happened in the same year. So I don't know, because I don't know the month. Or whether there was any causal relationship between the two.
Sure.
It was very sad. Van Dyck, died quite early. When you think that he did 1,000, that we have 1,023 portraits attributed to him, he was really knocking these out, fairly quickly. And he died in 41 at age 42, and the king was executed that same year. So I don't know which one happened first.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for the question, Claire. And then Katie is also asking, do you think that the sunflower, which was often regarded as a sign of devotion and fidelity, could be meant to consider in hand with the necklace from his patron to signify Van Dyck's devotion to his patron? So do you think both are kind of in reference?
Yes, I absolutely think so. I mean, that was not just by chance, that the gift of Charles I was included, in the work. And Charles I loved sunflowers, always had a sunflower with him. So Van Dyck was clearly devoted to the court. He also did quite a few other portraits of Mary Villiers and the family. I showed you one from 1637, but he had done portraits of her before the Timken, portrait, and afterwards. So he was quite a favorite also of Van Dyck.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that sunflower is definitely kind of a sign of
There's
that.
And someone asked fleur-de-lis, some of the equestrian portraits. Yeah, well, the fleur-de-lis, of course, is associated with Paris, the city, of Paris, the capital. So I don't think it's by chance, that it's included.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think I see another question from Claire. Did you say that Van Dyck is buried in England?
He is buried in England, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not certain, though. I am not certain that you can still see his grave. Something sticks in my mind that it may have been destroyed in the Great Fire of like 1666. So I don't know offhand if you can still see it.
Yeah. Tragedy. All right. Perfect. Any other questions? Any other comments? Again, thank you so much, Eleanor. Oh, let's see. John Singer Sargent is often mentioned as a worthy successor to Van Dyck. Other than their stylistic similarities, I was struck by how they both painted the aristocracy right before a period of significant turmoil. Yeah, the aristocracy Sargent painted was swept away in a less violent way, but the similarities ring true. Yes, Hemming, thank you so much for that comment. Yeah, that is a really interesting connection.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
No, Samantha, please.
Oh, I was going to say, I think it's really interesting in general with, kind of court portraits, how these artists, kind of, as you mentioned, are choosing to portray the royal family. Van Dyck is kind of taking a little bit more of a different approach with kind of showing them, in this kind of family unit and whatnot, which is, maybe not as formal as we've seen in the past, but still kind of keeping up that formality. So I think it's, kind of really interesting to see how people like Sargent, people like Van Dyck are kind of choosing to portray the royalty that they're.
Yeah, I mean, his predecessors, all of the portraits were rather stiff and formal. So he was, quite monumental in terms of, the changes that he, Charles was executed in 1649. Oh, thank you. He was later. I apologize for that. Okay, so he was quite a few years later. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Yeah, it is a tragedy though that, Van Dyck did die so young, as you mentioned. We have so much from him. It's amazing that he was able to get that much done when he passed away. So, very, kind of early in his career, as we might, kind of say, compared to other artists, I guess. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. If there are no other questions, yeah, having saying thank you so much. Yeah, super informative.
Thanks everyone.
Yeah, of course. As Elinor mentioned, this is kind of part 2 of a portrait series that she is very kindly decided to put together for us, and we're so thankful. And so the next one, as she mentioned, is going to be on Tuesday at the same time at 10 a.m. It's going to be on John Singleton Copley's New York portrait. So please feel free to join us for that. You can take a look at our calendar on the Timken website for the information for that, as well as other tours that are going on with us through the Timken. We're really happy to be able to still bring you, kind of virtual programming while the museum is still closed. So please feel free to check those out and join us for those future tours. And as I mentioned earlier, this tour and other tours are also going to be posted on our Facebook, our YouTube channel, other social media sites. So please feel free to check those out as well if you would like to kind of join us. Thank you so much, everyone. I see lots of thanks in the chat. So again, thank you, Elinor, and enjoy the
Thanks, Samantha. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.